All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to week 3 of Braving the Wilderness. We have a lot in store for us this evening. We're going to be talking about speaking truth, being civil, and connecting. So it's a lot to talk about tonight. We will get through as much as we can, but we have a little bit of cushion in next week since we only have one chapter scheduled. All right. So never did I ever think that there would be so much foul language in a church book study. So apologies. We'll just be talking about BS rather than saying out the full the full words. So there's a lot of BS that we'll be talking about tonight. And I hope that's okay with everyone. Mary asked if there's a recording of last week's session. There is. During one of our discussion times, when everyone's in small group, I'll get the YouTube recording link. All of the recordings go to the same playlist on YouTube. And I know some emails still didn't go through. I will be working on that tomorrow. Janice reminded us that Brené said, pray and curse. She gave us that heads up at the very beginning. The language is mild compared to life, but thanks. Well, it's still, I can't quite say as much BS as she talks about in the book, not in a church book study. So, all right. Okay, I've said this 3 times already. There's just so much in these chapters. To me, these are kind of the meatiest chapters of the whole book. So if for some reason you haven't read other chapters, skip ahead. These are the ones to really spend your time with. And I love that she gives us these definitions between lying and BS. I think internally we know this, but it's really good to have it laid out since there is so much, so much BS in our world these days. And, again, this came out in 2017. So think how much it's changed even since then. So number 1, it's helpful to think of lying as a defiance of the truth. When we're lying, we know we're lying. And BS is a wholesale dismissal of the truth. She quotes Harry Frankfurt, and that's where we're pulling these 3 differences between lying and BS. His book on BS is actually the name of the book. So he says, let's see here, that by virtue of this wholesale dismissal of the truth, BS is a greater enemy of the truth than lies are. And I think we have seen that play out in our world. So yeah. So we also, Megan was, I didn't see Heroes. He says, let us pray for peace. Amen. We do constantly. And Megan says they were assigned the book on BS for one of her MBA courses. And I love that. I might have to borrow that from you. So we often rely on BS when we feel compelled to talk about things we don't understand. And the contemporary spread of BS has a deeper source, our being skeptical and denying that we can ever know the truth of how things truly are. So there's so much happening in the world, and there are so many channels, thinking of social media especially, and even interacting with people. We are called upon to speak on such a breadth of topics that it's really impossible, unless your whole job is to learn everything about everything. It's impossible to speak knowledgeably about all of them. And so we slip into that BS stream. And so this contemporary spread, it's this whole postmodernist shift in the I'm not thinking, it's not the Enlightenment, but prior to postmodern, so postmodernism hit and capital T truth, we can know things for certain. That is done away with. And now it is little t truth, that what is true for me is what really matters. So this whole pendulum swing of what truth is has really changed in the last, I guess, almost century by now, as we've been in this postmodernist age. And then we set up you're either with us or against us. And we've all been there. So it's this play on emotions, and we hear it during times of emotional stress. And it's one of the most effective political sorters. I mean, this happens all the time. We can think back to, and I think this is used in the book, back to 9/11. There was very much an you're either for us or you're against us within that whole discourse on what to do. But it's a false dichotomy or false dilemma, turning an emotion-driven approach into weaponized belonging. And that's why it feels so bad. That's why it feels so bad. And it almost always benefits the person throwing down the gauntlet. So, how do we speak truth? And Brené says, get curious and ask questions outside of the bunkers of certainty. So, back in our first session, you might remember that we talked about the difference between certainty and curiosity. And I see this playing out again and again and again, that when we take these stances of certainty, that we are very inflexible, we're not willing to listen to anyone else. What we say is truth, and no one can speak to that. But if we flip that into curiosity, how can we uh, challenge that certainty and ask the questions to pull us out of that? Janice asked, should we use the phrase my truth? Yes. I might want you to say more about that. Janice, would you unmute yourself and say a little more about that?
Whenever this is my truth, and they use it as a weapon,
Mm.
that you can't argue against. And so I've gotten to the point where whenever it's for me, whenever someone says my truth, because I was always taught that there's truth, but there's not my truth and your truth and her truth. Truth is truth, right?
And that is the whole dilemma. that sums it up perfectly. Because so many people do say my truth and rely on my truth above all else. And that's when we get into this bunker of certainty. So you have named it perfectly. And so we have to get curious and ask these questions. So here we go. Refuse to accept the terms of the argument by challenging the framing of the debate. So rather than this either or, so this certainty, the world wants to boil everything down to binaries. It is either or, but we know that it can be both and. It is, the world wants black and white, where there's a lot of gray and a lot of nuance to be found in that gray. So how can we reframe the terms of the argument? So if someone says, okay, my truth, this is my truth, you can't challenge that. What do we do? I'm curious. I don't know that I have a good answer. So do you guys have any suggestions? Put them in the chat. How do we reframe the argument, the either or of this is my truth and you can't challenge it? Well, I think Getting curious helps. Oh, define truth. Thanks, Nancy. You can suck it up and say, tell me more. No, it's okay. That's a great answer. Ask the person what they mean. Tell me more. Yeah, so it's this curiosity. Ask for parameters based on what that truth is laid out upon. Yes, yes, yes. I love that. And chances are good we're not going to necessarily, oh, how did you arrive to this? We might not change things, but we might make some progress. And progress, even if we've started to plant seeds in people who are in this place, that can make a difference. People would rather be heard than be right. Thank you for that reminder, Janice. And Lana says, be respectful in questioning. Yes, this respectful, that is so, so true. And we have to bring that level of respect and be honestly curious, not just looking to listen and respond. Okay. Oh, yeah. She had a great suggestion of opening the conversation by saying what you see and why. Not all will be receptive, but some will. Calm voice and respectful and honest. You guys are brilliant. This is why we do this in a group. Try to calm them down with a friendly voice. Yeah, perhaps. Yeah, experience, listening for understanding. These are really wonderful suggestions because silence comes at a cost, and it's both individual and collective. Individually, we pay with our integrity, and we know that feeling when we have let our integrity go just to go along, and it doesn't feel good. And collectively, we pay with divisiveness and bypass effective problem solving, like what you guys are doing in the chat here. So it depends on the topic. Is it your view of the world, or is it science? Is it actual facts, or is it subjective? You can believe gravity is not your truth, but it doesn't really care and it will still be in effect. Yes. Yes. Okay. So sometimes saying, I'm just not where you are, and do that with pleasant eye contact and open body language. Yeah. So these are really wonderful ways of holding your integrity, but helping to get curious and pull people out of those bunkers, because they're not going to come out of bunkers if they don't feel safe. And what you all are naming in the chat are a lot of ways to help people feel safe and engage. So we get into, if we do remain silent, if we don't speak truth, we get into this BS incivility cycle. So false dilemmas are set up often because we're working from a place of fear, acute emotion, and lack of knowledge. And this is the perfect setup for uncivil behavior. Gosh, I could ask you when you've seen this, and I know the chat would just be flooded because we have seen this again and again and again and again. And it's hard to believe that it's 2024 and we're still seeing this, and it's only getting worse. So BS is interested in a shared starting point. So finding that place of like, oh yeah, we hate all these things, rather than the actual truth, which leads to the truth doesn't matter. What I think matters. My truth. This is exactly what we were saying. So my truth is that shared starting point. And Brandolini's law, which is found on page 94, the amount of energy needed to refute BS is an order or magnitude bigger than to produce it. It takes so much more energy to refute and uncover BS than it does just to start spewing it. And I think we've all been there. Cynthia liked that quote. So we have some practices to speak truth. Approach BS with generosity whenever possible. And you all were naming that in the chat. So thank you for the generosity that you shared in your solutions. So generosity, empathy, curiosity can go a long way in our efforts to question what we're hearing and introduce fact. You all named it spot on. Practice civility, which looks like so easier said than done, 100%. None of this is easy, not even close to easy, or else our world would be a very different place. So civility is claiming and caring for one's identity, needs, and beliefs without denigrating someone else's in the process. Civility is the hard work of staying present even with those whom we have deep-rooted and fierce disagreements. The full quote can be found on page 95 to 96. I just pulled two parts of it. And Brené gives just unbelievable examples from these next few chapters. So as I was reading these examples, the questions that kept sparking for me are, what are the unpopular opinions you hold that go against this either or narrative? And or when have you gone along to get along? And I want to share one example that sort of speaks to this either or narrative. And BS, it's, yeah. Okay. So when Notre Dame had the fire, I don't remember how many years ago it was, but a number of years ago, had the fire, and so much was destroyed in that fire. And immediately the world outpoured generosity, and they were raising funds to rebuild this historic cathedral in no time. The Washington National Cathedral is so jealous from its earthquake repair. We're still raising the money 13 years later to rebuild. But Notre Dame, they raised Notre Dame, sorry, they raised the money in an instant because there was a connection from people all over the world. So it's this beautiful outpouring of love. And then, and then people started saying, but why are you giving the money to build a building from stone rather than to feed the people, to clothe the people, to help in the war-torn places? And this whole tide moved in that direction. And there was shaming. There's a lot of shaming going on in this. But it was set up as either you're for us or against us. Either you only care about Notre Dame or you only care about feeding the poor. There was no middle ground. We can care about both. That's that paradox. We can care about rebuilding this historic cathedral, and we can care about feeding the poor and do both. So I just, there are so many examples that keep happening. Brené's story about gun culture and the either or narrative for her was so relatable. So I want, let's stop sharing, and I want to have a little more conversation. If you have one of these reflections to share, will you raise your hand and share with the larger group? And just a reminder that if you have your camera on, there's a chance you'll be caught on our recording tonight. All right, Cynthia.
Thanks. I wasn't here last week, so I missed the discussion, and I appreciate you being, able to share the discussion from last week. These chapters really spoke to me, especially on how to handle this either or dichotomy. I find myself frequently caught up in that and kind of caught off guard. And I know my father and I would get in these discussions where I would just leave frustrated because he was an either or person. Either you believed what I believed or you don't, and you don't get to talk about it. I don't want to hear your point. And I really wish when he was alive that I had thought about digging into why. like, why do you believe this? And trying to understand that more, as opposed to just being so frustrated by that dichotomy. It was, I did not think about digging in and asking those questions and maybe trying to get a better understanding. So, and I, I think I get emotional
Mhm.
when it gets that either or, and I get defensive, and I have a tendency to be like, oh. So, and I don't know how other people handle that, but I feel like that gave me some ideas on how I might handle that in the future.
Yeah, and I think chapter 7 will really speak to that emotional response that you're talking about when we get there. I can't wait for chapter 7. But thank you for sharing that. Anyone else want to share? In the chat, we have curious about how Jesus's truth of peace was rejected in the beginning, shared with the public, debated, fought, and accepted eventually. Yes and no. But I think speaking to that, Pharisees fall very much into this either or, this you're either for us or you're against us category, as we're thinking very biblically about that. Roxanne.
Yeah, I'm thinking about very emotional issues. And if you say the tell me more about that, why do you feel that way? And then if you can't listen because you're so frustrated and you want to jump in. So you need to give your own self, you need to not jump in on what they're saying. Or maybe let's just agree to give each other 2 minutes to talk about our points of view.
Yeah.
Either that or you're like somebody in my family who we just don't talk about those things because we get too frustrated with each other.
Yeah. Yeah, so setting a time limit, that's actually a really great strategy. Can also, you could take those 2 minutes to have some time to reflect and breathe, to collect thoughts rather than have that emotional reaction. Let it be a more centered reaction or centered conversation rather than just a reaction. Excellent. Anyone else have something they want to share? Has anyone gone along to get along? Have you been in that situation? Cheryl says she agrees to disagree if I feel unsafe or feel it is not the time for the discussion. That's really good wisdom, Cheryl. It's not always time to have the conversation. Hard for us who are introverts because by the time I have a response, they've moved on. So sometimes I just say, I'll get back to you. Deborah, so you guys may or may not know this. I'm actually a huge introvert and a very slow internal processor. So I resonate with that a lot. Investry meetings, yes. For those who might not speak Episcopalian, vestry is the governing board for the church. It helps to make the policy and decisions for the running of the church. But yes, and in vestry meetings, it also goes back to that culture. What is the culture that has been set up? And Brené talks about in her chief of staff story that she shares. How do we set up a culture where people feel safe and able to have healthy disagreements? And that's one of the best things that we can do, because we don't want to be a mono voice. We want to have all of these different voices. Lana says, as mothers, I think we go along to get along quite a bit within our own homes. Yes. Yes, I think that resonates also. Sometimes I feel like when I encounter the either or statements that feel confrontational, the other person doesn't really want to have a conversation, but expects me to just give in or start a fight. Yes. So a lot of work that we're doing is being aware, so that we can change these repetitive habits that we've gotten into, these repetitive patterns of dialogue. And the more that we can be aware when it happens, the more we can take that step back and say, all right, I'm going to pull out some of my braving tools and see what I need to work with here. Jean says, sometimes I just need to protect myself, so I withdraw. And that can be setting a healthy boundary. So it's recognizing when it's healthy and setting that boundary and when you're pulling back too much. But it can be very healthy to pull back. Close friends who have opposite political views, but they're wonderful friends. And so we just don't talk about politics. That's all right. I think that's probably a good way to be and to share and still be in relationship, because you never know what's going to happen down the road. All right. In the interest of time, I'm going to keep going with our presentation. Okay. Words as weapons. So I think it was, I can't remember if it was last week or the week before, we talked about how language creates reality and how we say things can really make a difference. So even tools of civility can become weaponized if the intention is there. So when people turn using the right language into a weapon to shame or belittle. And I want to know if I'm saying, Brené says this, I want to know if I'm saying something that's hurtful. I want to be kind and thoughtful with my words because I'm keenly aware of how much they matter. Yes. Oh, Judith had, let's see, I think there are two. So Nancy first said, what about finding common ground other than the either or, such as kids and organizations? Yes, finding common ground. And she talks about that. How do we find this common ground? I think that's in the next chapter, probably. And Judith says, I try to remember that I may not know their background story of the other individual and respect their responses, which might be from fear or anxiety. Ooh, texting is a huge problem in Words Matter. Texting and social media, anywhere that we are putting words out there that don't have any vocal connotation or body language, where we're not held accountable to them, all of that really makes a difference. And I think we've seen a lot of tools of civility become weaponized. And it can be very, very painful and counterproductive to our purposes. It will make people not want to use the words of civility. So she pulls out the braving framework again, in light of speaking truth and being civil. So for the boundaries, how do you set a boundary when you realize you're knee deep in BS? Wow. And sometimes you guys set some boundaries in the chat. Sometimes that does mean pulling back to get out of the waters of BS. But there are lots of ways that we can set boundaries. Setting a boundary is taking a 2-minute time out. That's a boundary. So you guys have already been brainstorming some of those boundaries. Reliability. BS is the abandonment of reliability. It's hard to trust or be trusted when we BS too often. I don't think I need to say anything more about that. Accountability. How do we hold ourselves and others accountable for less BS and more honest debate? Less offloading of emotion and more civility. That's a tough one. And we talked about some of those things, but that accountability is huge because a lot of people don't want to be accountable. Accountability is hard. It's painful and it requires something of us. What does offloading of emotion mean? So I read that to mean in BS is coming out of these emotionally charged times. We find and it's when we're moving out of civility. It's that BS incivility cycle. So when we're playing on when we're working from a place of fear, acute emotion, and lack of knowledge, that's when BS comes out. So it's the false dichotomy. Got it. Good. Thank you. Sometimes I talk too much. So the vault. Civility honors confidentiality. BS ignores truth and opens the door to violations of confidentiality. It's pretty self-explanatory. I had a friend who ran into using words as weapon at camp, where using pronouns was the thing to do, and there's a subtle shaming going on if you didn't use or state your pronouns. We no matter what camp we're in, we tend to think, and I'm talking about like political camp, right-leaning, left-leaning, we tend to think our particular camp is the better one. So if in this case, we're in the progressive camp on the left side of the political spectrum, using pronouns is important. When we're in the Zoom room, you're going to see me. I'm going to always have my pronouns there because it's a way to help others who do use. I have cis pronouns, she, her, but those who don't have that need the people with the cis pronouns to be in that space just as much. However, we take it too far. It is easy to take it too far and to turn it into shaming. So it happens on all sides of the spectrum. Integrity. How do we stay in our integrity when confronted with BS? And how do we stop in the midst of our own emotional moment to say, I'm not sure this conversation is productive, or I need to learn more. So you guys spoke to this. Again, it's those boundaries. It is always, and I just, you know how she talks about giving yourself permission slips? Give yourself a permission slip. It is always okay to call a timeout. Whether you need to breathe, whether you need to calm down, whether you need to take a walk, it is always okay to call a timeout, because that can help you circle back to a place of integrity versus working out of that emotional place. Non-judgment. So how do we stay out of judgment toward ourselves? And how do we not go into this winner-loser mode and see an opportunity for connection? We'll talk more about connection in a moment. Generosity. What boundaries have to be in place for us to be kinder and more tolerant? I think we talked about a lot of that as well. All right, so a time of reflection, and I'm going to break us up into our small groups in just a moment. In what situations do you find your internal BS meter, this is my own phrase, creeping up? So when are you detecting BS? So just thinking about, you know, in conversations or in large group situations, watching TV, when do we find that BS meter creeping up into dangerous levels? And how does that feel in your body? So I want us to practice getting to know this within ourselves and talking about the tools. So in the situations, we can be civil. So how might you take a step back and practice civility instead? And there were so many amazing stories in this chapter. What resonates with you the most and why? Welcome back, everyone. I am curious if anyone has anything to share from their small groups. And it's perfectly fine if you don't.
Can I just say it out loud, or do I have to type it in the typey
No,
thing?
you can say it out. This is the out loud time. Yeah.
Okay, fine. So I just I found that, like, one thing we talked about is, particularly when you're entering a new community, it can be really hard to like say your truth and whatnot, because it's often more important to connect than to, you know, state an opinion. And so that you have to kind of decide, like, what is the most important thing right now. So sometimes just being silent and learning more about others is the most important thing.
Yeah, because within those, it's through forging those connections that you can make progress if you need to. So that's a lot of wisdom there. Thank you for sharing that. Deborah wrote, it's a challenge for all of us. And Nancy, go ahead.
I mentioned that I'm glad to be learning these skills because they're necessary, and I wish I had them a few years earlier for a couple of very uncomfortable conversations.
Thank you for sharing that. We'll hold that close and pray that, I don't know if those situations have been mended, but if not, that they will be. And before we broke out, I missed this. Jean had written in the chat that timeout can be attacked by an aggressive person, and that's very true too. So, oh, I like that. We notice the more certain the speaker sounds, the higher they tend to score on our BS meters. Yeah. And kind of that charismatic. Yeah. It's the charismatic plus the certainty that gets me every time. It's not always true that it's BS, but there's a high likelihood. It causes that meter to go up and the signals to flare, and so we have to listen a whole lot more carefully. And it's that sense of, you know, we said this, you know, in text and on social media, anywhere we can leave words without vocal intonation or accountability, it's easy to click share or to take truth, and we're not as likely to hear the BS in those situations without taking that step back. And so it's really easy to perpetuate this BS, and then it kind of balloons, and like all of a sudden you realize, like, wait a second, this isn't the full truth. This isn't as generous or as kind as it could be. So thinking about that, Kristen wrote in, that was a good story, where rally the troops speeches were not as well received as the ones when we're all in this together. Ah, the new name of gaslighting. Yes, yes, yes. Judy, thank you for this. I'm finding that often BS comes out of someone's fear. It does. It really does. And we're afraid a lot. And that's why we're coming together, so that we can, I don't know if be afraid together, but if we can talk about these fears in honest and vulnerable ways in communities that are hopefully safe, then that's when we make those inches of progress that start to add up out of fear and insecurity. All right, I'm going to move on to the start of chapter 6, this hold hands with strangers. I loved this chapter. I cried through a lot of this chapter. I don't know about you guys. It's reading those stories that touch us. So forging connection, that's what this is all about. The connection between, I found this so fascinating. I had no idea. The connection between humans cannot be broken, but our belief in the connection is constantly tested and repeatedly severed. I had never looked at it from that perspective. So that part right there just sort of blew things open for me. And it's also one of our most renewable resources of courage in the wilderness. If you take nothing else from our time tonight, this slide is so huge, so huge. And this is what we need to navigate the coming months. I loved, she referenced this cartoon, and as I was reading it, I immediately downloaded it. I love mankind. It's the people I can't stand. Yes, that is so true. But we love the people too. We love the people too. So forging connection. Showing up for these collective moments of joy and pain so we can actually bear witness to inextricable human connection. And she shared some of these memories of joy and pain that we have collectively shown up for. And it can be in communities, it can be in churches, it can be in families, it can be in countries, and it can be in the world. And what are the collective moments of joy and pain that have forged connection that you have been a part of? I am going to stop our large share because this is a conversation. I'm going to start out with one. Um, the eclipse that happened in April was one of those moments of shared joy that transcended like everything. Um, so Cleveland was in the path of totality for the eclipse. And I'm like, okay, cool. I've seen a partial eclipse. That's great. But everybody's making this big deal. We had friends travel in from out of town, and we gathered at the high school field. And there's the high school field, and then there's an elementary school right next door. And there were hundreds of people around us. And when the totality happened, there was this collective gasp of awe that I have never heard before. And not only are we experiencing the awe of this magical event, it's not magical, but you know what I mean. But we're experiencing it together. And that was something that you just don't get. So showing up for these things, she talked about showing up for the Women's March in DC. We're afraid of making fools of ourselves. That's right, Beryl. So my past history, I'm going to talk one more story. My past history, I was a youth leader, and I led in both local churches and did national work. And in the Presbyterian Church in North Carolina, there is a place called Montreat. It's in the mountains of North Carolina. And over the course of 6 weeks in the summer, thousands of youth come to these conferences. 5,000 to 6,000 youth come over the course of these weeks. And every single day starts off with a couple of things. It starts off with prayer. It starts off with singing and worship. And it starts off with everyone collectively making a fool of themselves. We call them energizers in the Presbyterian Church, and it is literally just dancing around to silly songs in unison far before TikToks became popular. But by doing this, by everyone making a fool of themselves together, it levels the playing field. It's amazing. And there's my Zoom reaction. So I will stop talking now. And Cynthia, what do you have to share with us? And then I'll get to the chat.
So reading this, I thought about sitting with pain, and I reflected back to 9/11 and going to a church that was just close to my office. It wasn't my church, but going and just sitting and praying with people after 9/11, it even gets me choked up now. Just the need for that connection after something so horrible. And she talks about that around Sandy Hook.
Mhm.
But I could have been at home just watching the news and getting more and more and more scared. But I took that time to go and be in a church with people that needed that connection. And I gained so much from that.
Mhm.
And then I also think about the joy of marching in President Obama's inauguration parade and being part of a group of Peace Corps volunteers from all over the world, because I marched to represent the country that I had served with.
Mm.
And how cool it was. It wasn't even just the marching part. It was just being there, being on the mall, being with these people in freezing cold weather, and being able to march and share that moment and the joy of it with so many people on the mall in DC. That was just like this amazing experience.
Yeah.
That kind of transcended things for me.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Anyone else have these transcendent experiences of joy or pain? There. Oh, I was going to read from the chat. We have a couple in here. Is there need to share common rules in contesting truth with others? Civility, yes. Don't know how we do it if others don't take such a rule. Right. So we're running into this, that we don't all share these same rules of civility. And how do we do that? And convince people of the importance of this shared and common humanity. That's right. Montreat is a special place if you've ever been there. Cedar Park, Texas was in totality also playground with 300 elementary school kids. That's awesome, Mary. Grace also thought about how well we gathered after 9/11 and the shared pain of the tolling of the bell here in DC for the million dead from COVID was transformative. Yeah. Yeah. And so thinking about 9/11 when we could go to those churches and connect together versus COVID when we're stuck in our houses. And the fear cycles are the same, but how we are able to respond. And we did overcome that with Zoom and all of that. But as we know, it has its limitations. But the fear cycle is the same and we can respond in different ways. So it's just really interesting to think about it. When we had the shooting in Virginia Beach in 2019, it seemed right and true to gather in church. It's what support groups are all about. Thank you for that reminder. Grief Share, AA, Weight Watchers. We can choose to share our struggle with others, and studies tend to show that if you show up in person for these things, the better you will recover or progress. Post George Floyd, we had riots in our community and people gathered and created artwork on doors and walls. Yeah. There's so many ways that we can continue to show up. Does anyone else? And she talks about funerals and how important it is to show up at those times of grief and bearing witness. And my husband happens to be at a funeral right now for someone in his church. So it is the showing up. It matters so much. Ray said, this chapter reminded me to support people who are creating groups. We have a song prayer group at church. I'm going to go to that. That sounds lovely. Ray, or Gwen, sorry.
Hi, this whole discussion reminds me of the early chapters of Job, in which after he was afflicted with all these awful things, that his two friends just came and sat with him. It never says whether they were talking with him or anything. It just says they just sat with him. And I think that's a great example of just, being with someone who's in pain and just being there for them and sharing their pain.
Amen. Thank you for that. And as we come to a close tonight, see, we barely made it through half of chapter 6. I knew that was going to happen. Does anyone have any final thoughts? And if not, I have a prayer for us. I think it's giving the peace. Oh yes, passing the peace at church. As an introvert, I have to consciously leave my seat to greet others. Yeah, she mentions one of these things is going to church and shaking hands and sharing bread with people that in other situations she might want to punch. But that's what we do. And that's what church is for. Sometimes it's comfortable to be in churches where people think the same way about all things. But I think we're also doing the gospel a disservice if we're that way. It's easier for sure, but what voices are we missing in those times? That being said, we have to make sure that people are sharing in these braving tools and having a safe and loving environment. So it's the balance. Right. So she mentions John O'Donohue. So he is an Irish teacher and poet, and he draws Celtic spirituality into poems and prayers. And this is a book called To Bless the Space Between Us. Janice is a fan. It's a book of blessings. So in Braving the Wilderness, I wanted to share his prayer for courage tonight. So let us pray. When the light around you lessens and your thoughts darken until your body feels fear turn, cold as a stone inside. When you find yourself bereft of any belief in yourself, and all you unknowingly leaned on has fallen. When one voice commands your whole heart, and it is raven dark. Steady yourself and see that it is your own thinking that darkens your world. Search and you will find a diamond thought of light. Know that you are not alone and that this darkness has purpose. Gradually, it will school your eyes to find the one gift your life requires, hidden within this night corner. Invoke the learning of every suffering you have suffered. Close your eyes, gather all the kindling about your heart to create one spark. That is all you need to nourish the flame that will cleanse the dark of its weight of festered fear. A new confidence will come alive to urge you toward higher ground, where your imagination will learn to engage difficulty at its most rewarding threshold. Amen. Feel like that could have been written for this book. I'm putting the name of the book in the chat to bless the space between. Thank you all so much for your time and engagement tonight. I'm so thankful for you all for being here and the ways that you have engaged, and I have learned from you all tonight. So thank you all.
Can you put the link to the previous?
I put it up there in the chat. Let me copy. I might
didn't
actually
see it.
have it still. There we go. That's the link to the playlist. And I know a few emails didn't quite make it to their targets last week either, so I'm going to work on that tomorrow.
Thank
All
you.
right. Blessings and peace be with you. Take care, and I'll see you next week.